Silicon Valley has always sold us a story about disruption, about genius, about changing the world. In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford dropout claimed she would revolutionize blood testing. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. Her company, Theranos. Her promise, hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. What followed wasn't innovation. It was one of the most dramatic corporate collapses of the last 50 years. A scandal involving secrecy, intimidation, federal investigations, and prison sentences. This is the story of Theranos and how communication, not just faulty technology, turned a corporate crisis into a catastrophe. Act 1. The Rise. Holmes founded Theranos in 2003. By 2014, she was being compared to Steve Jobs. She wore black turtlenecks, spoke in a carefully measured, unnaturally deep voice, promised to democratize healthcare. Investors believed her. High-profile figures like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz sat on the board. At its peak, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. There was just one problem. The technology didn't work. Act 2. The Cracks. In 2015, investigative journalist John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal began publishing reports. Former employees alleged test results were wildly inaccurate, devices malfunctioned. The company secretly relied on traditional blood analyzers. Patients may have received incorrect diagnosis, lives were potentially at risk. The story was no longer about innovation, it was about deception. Act 3. The Response. This is where crisis communication becomes critical. Instead of transparency, Theranos chose denial. Holmes went on television, insisting everything was fine. The company threatened whistleblowers with lawsuits. It attacked critics with credibility. Under Timothy Combs' situational crisis communication theory, this is what we would call preventable crisis. SCCT argues that when stakeholders attribute high responsibility to an organization, especially in cases involving negligence or deception, the organization must adopt rebuilding strategies, apologizing, corrective action, compensation. Theranos did the opposite. They used deny and diminish strategies, appropriate only when the organization has little or no responsibility. But this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a rumor. This was systematic misrepresentation, and stakeholders knew it. The more Holmes denied, the more public outrage intensified. Act 4. Investigations. Regulators stepped in. The Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services banned Holmes from operating a lab. In 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and former President Ramesh Balwani with massive fraud. Criminal indictments followed. The image of the visionary founder began to crumble. In 2022, Holmes was convicted on multiple counts of fraud. She was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. Balwani received nearly 13 years. Theranos dissolved. Act 5. Crisis Communication Analysis. Through SCCT, this case becomes painfully clear. The crisis type, preventable. Theranos created the crisis through intentional actions. Attribution of responsibility, extremely high. Patients, investors, and regulators saw this as deception and not error. Recommended strategy under SCCT: full apology, immediate corrective action, radical transparency, independent verification, and victim compensation. The actual strategy they chose to choose was denial, legal intimidation, media counterattacks, and controlled narratives. This mismatch between responsibility and response intensified reputational damage. SCCT predicts this outcome. When organizations deny responsibility in preventable crises, reputational harm multiplies. Theranos didn't just fail technology, it failed communicatively. Act 6, the bigger lesson. This crisis wasn't just about faulty blood tests, it exposed a culture of secrecy, board governance failure, media hype cycles, the myth of untouchable founders. But most importantly, it showed that crisis communication is not spin, it's accountability. Marston's overview of crisis communication frameworks reminds us that pre-crisis communication matters as much as post-crisis repair. Theranos failed on both fronts. It ignored internal warnings, pre-crisis issue management, and mishandled public response, post-crisis reputation management. Practical recommendations for leaders facing similar crises. Diagnose the crisis correctly. If responsibility is high, denial will destroy you. Act before exposure. Internal dissent is a gift, not a threat. Align communication with reality. Narratives collapse when facts contradict them. Protect stakeholders first, patients, customers, employees, not valuation. Transparency is cheaper than litigation. Theranos spent millions fighting critics. It spent billions in reputation collapse. Closing. Theranos wasn't brought down by bad press. It was brought down by truth catching up to narrative. In crisis communication, the story you tell must eventually align with the story reality tells. When it doesn't, the collapse isn't just likely, it's inevitable.